Well, really grateful to get Dan Collado back for the Multiply Network. He's the Aboriginal Bible Academy director and also Indigenous Canadians coordinator with Mission Canada. And so we're excited to have you on to talk about some heavy stuff today. But thanks for being here.
It's great to be here, Paul. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, so we're going to dive right in. Obviously, recently there was 215 children's bodies found in Kamloops residential school. As we were talking offline, there's obviously way more than just this school, upwards of 3,200 confirmed in residential schools all over Canada. I guess this realization of the 215 was way more than anyone thought. Wondering the impact it had on you personally, and then maybe the Indigenous community that you work with.
Yeah, sure, Paul. Thank you. It's interesting, kind of framing uh, that inquiry with this discovery and how obviously shocking that it is, and understandably so. It's it was a shocking and startling revelation for much of our nation. Um, but the truth is, like for those within kind of like within the Indigenous context, within the Indigenous community, uh, unfortunately, it was less shocking and startling,
Right.
and it was really a sobering confirmation
Yeah.
of what had really long been suspected,
Yeah.
and claimed by our Indigenous people across Canada. And there hadn't been that collective will of, confirming
Right.
those suspicions and those rumors. I know with the Kamloops situation specifically, there had been rumors for years, concerning, potentially this mass grave. Um, and there had been works for years, or efforts trying to get there to be an extensive search concerning this, and it just so when it finally
Yeah.
broke out on May 28th, it was just confirmation of what Indigenous people had been saying for years, for decades.
It was shocking to me to find out that I think the last residential school closed in 1996, and that was something that as a I've been here my whole life as a Canadian, love our Canadian history, much of it. We take pride in some of it, and then to have this and to talk about it as like ancient history,
Mm.
to have people commenting going, why are we talking about this as ancient history when it's the last one was closed in 1996? How did we not, how did we miss this, Dan? I mean, I don't know if you have a good answer for this one, but like, how did we as the church miss this?
It's yeah, it's quite interesting. I can't help but kind of compare, the two forks in the road of Indigenous relations within this newfound land that, supposedly Christopher Columbus was to have discovered. And then you had the Canadian colonists, you had the American colonists, so these British colonists, and ones wanted to remain loyal to the crown, the others wanted to strike out on their own. And I know as you begin to follow the history of Canadian and American Indigenous relations, um, within the U.S., much more of a confrontational um,
Right.
history with the Indian Wars
Yep.
and a lot of bloody battles, where we supposedly, as Canadians, much more civilized, with our British allegiances, Um, and I've often said that although there wasn't as much bloodshed on the battlefield here in Canada, our battlefields actually ended up being in the courtrooms and the classrooms
Yep.
um, of the forming of our country. And so we hid the travesties, the tragedies, um, the sin
Yeah.
behind education and and civilized government.
Yeah.
And we use that level of nomenclature uh, to make ourselves comfortable with what we were doing to try to get rid of the Indian, where the Americans were perhaps trying to physically kill the
Yeah.
Indian. Here in Canada, it was about wanting to just kill the Indian in the Indian.
Mm,
And ended up being perhaps a much more nefarious type of strategy because it lasted a whole lot longer.
it did.
As you said, with residential schools being in operation until 1996. And the first one was 1831, the building. And prior to that, there's history of
Of
pointing to like the
course.
1600s
Of course.
with the Catholic Church and the nuns helping to kind of collect the children together, beginning
Yeah.
the educational process.
Yeah.
So it's a lengthy history where
Yeah.
we've hid behind becoming civilized.
Well, I'm grateful for leaders like you that not only speak truth and grace, but are educating us. One of the things that I heard even you talk about at our chapel today. So this is the second time I've heard you talk about this, and just learning so much. Uh, you talked about in Indigenous culture where you see, you listen, and you learn. And even back into Indigenous culture and history, that was how they approached the world, to see, to listen, and to learn. Um, what do we need to be seeing as the church right now? What do we need to be listening to? And maybe just talk to us about what we need to be learning.
Sure. Yeah, that's very much an indigenous perspective of how to see the world, how to understand the world around you, um, to see, to listen, and to learn. And we do certainly well to adopt that
I agree.
position
I agree.
within our hearts and minds. I know that I have personally been fielding a number of inquiries, um, and questions since the Kamloops tragedy kind of came to light, and
Yeah.
it's been from like congregation members, pastors, district leadership,
Yep.
and many are really wrestling with all of this, right? And I've really appreciated the tone of the conversations. They've been honest inquiries, right? And they've been centered around kind of like, oh, what do we do now,
Yep.
right? The response,
Yep.
and it's a key question. It's something that we need to be asking
Right.
ourselves. Um, and what we need to do, I think, not only as say a national fellowship or as a regional district or as a local church or even as a next door neighbor,
Yeah.
um, we need to be positioning ourselves towards reconciliation. Many of our indigenous communities, they've been hit quite hard with grief during this time. And those others that might be outside of that direct experience, I know they can find it difficult to just know how to adequately respond.
Yeah.
And I think an added hurdle to that also can be if there kind of was a lack of pre-existing relationship,
Yep.
that kind of like predates the tragedy.
Yep.
And so they might find that we don't have any initial, common ground, as it were, to build from.
Yep.
Um, but if I was to be really practical as to, okay, what are we going to do? We're wanting to see, we're wanting to listen, we're wanting to learn. What are our action steps? And, one of the first practical suggestions, aside from obviously wanting to be willing to put your plow, put yourself in the place of the person that's hurting, those that are hurting, those that are grieving. You want to be beside them,
It's
hurting
great.
and grieving
That's
along
great.
with them.
Yeah.
Um, it needs to start there. It's like you go to any funeral, any recent death of a loved one. You're not looking for a whole lot of words and wisdom from people. It's less about the proclamation and it's about the presence. You want
Yeah.
people there with you. And for a long time, perhaps the church hasn't been in a healthy way present.
Right.
We've been good at the proclamation in some ways, but not always perhaps in the presentation
Yeah.
in our presence. And so I think a practical suggestion, I'd suggest, like, say, for the local church, for the next door neighbor, those that are looking to, to make a response, to have a response, your first question should be, okay, well, do I have any connection at all with any Indigenous context, with any Indigenous person? Be
Yeah.
it, say, there might be members in your church that are, from an Indigenous community, or friends or acquaintances or co-workers that are
Yeah.
from an Indigenous community.
Yeah.
Um, Start there, find that out, and ask them, how are they doing?
Yeah.
um, what what can I do, for you to help you? um, but to first find out um, if there's an Indigenous connection there, and find out how they're feeling.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, without some level of prior connection, I recognize it can
Yeah.
be difficult to properly communicate like genuine sense of compassion, right? As well, it can be seen as an attempt, right, to kind
Yeah.
of um,
Almost like
uh,
tokenism. It's like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
just
it can
like
be seen as, well, I'm just trying to absolve myself of white guilt, right? Or
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but the thing is, it's still better to do something
Yep.
than nothing. And to that end, if a person or church, is not aware of, say, any current or past connections that your church may have with, say, an Indigenous community that's near in your area,
Yeah.
then at the very least, I'd suggest like a phone call, a letter from the church to the band council, to the chief and
Yeah.
council,
Great idea.
expressing your grief and sorrow for the recent, revelations, say, in Kamloops,
Yeah.
and just ask, is there something that we can do to assist in the healing process?
Great advice.
Arranging, a face-to-face follow-up with the council and chief would be ideal.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I mean, that can be risky, admittedly, because it places the church in a vulnerable position for rejection, right?
Yep.
But the thing is, a connection needs to be made.
Yep.
And so it's got to start somewhere. And then I think from those initial steps, you can then decipher if maybe something more is warranted. Like maybe there needs to be an apology within your local setting. Um, and I recognize, I mean, I'm fourth generation Pentecostal myself. My grandparents, my great grandparents, Mohawk, they were Pentecostal,
Yeah.
right? And I realized Pentecostals were not the ones who perpetrated, this particular travesty, certainly in Kamloops, but we do represent,
Yeah.
the larger Christian community, right? That did some very deplorable things in
Yeah.
the name of Christ. And so, aside from that, we've often been guilty of not paying much attention to Canadian Indigenous realities, and then not speaking up when we should have. Um,
Yeah.
but if a church or an individual, wants to go this route, you only want to do this if you truly intend to follow through with,
Hmm.
like, making yourself and making the church available to serve.
Thanks for sharing
Um,
that. That's so
yeah.
important.
um, it's
So
it's
important.
really just,
Wow.
it's an opportunity to begin to forge a journey of relationship, but the church has got to be consistent, and it's going to take time. This is a long game strategy, if you will,
Yeah.
use a sports metaphor,
Yeah.
because the initial step is just being willing to walk in the hurt and grief along with those that are hurting and grieving. And from that presence, you you gain the opportunity to proclaim. But we've got to be there longer than we
Yeah.
have been historically.
I'm so glad you said that because I think we can look at this as a one-off and feel like we've done something. And in that, I think you accurately say that is a good starting point. That's important. Even if you get rejected, even if things don't kind of play out like you'd hope they would, you've made an effort, and then you keep making an effort, and you keep making an effort. Um, I just I'm so grateful for your wisdom on this because I think the shock to the Canadian church, to Canadians, never mind Canadian church, just to Canadians, is, well, what can we do? And I think this simple kind of three thought thing: see, listen, learn. When you were talking about that, I started thinking about, okay, who are some Indigenous friends that I have, connections, people that I know, that maybe I just need to reach out to and just say, hey, how are you feeling? And that was very, very good. Any final thoughts? Any encouragement? I mean, obviously, one of the things we want to do is pray. Pray for doors to open. Pray for opportunities to bring. And what I think the ministry of Jesus we need now is, I like you were saying, the preaching and teaching has been there. We actually need, the church needs to show up as healers now.
Yeah.
We need the healing ministry of Jesus to show up in our churches, not just for Indigenous. I think this summer and fall, there's a ton of grief in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But especially for our Indigenous brothers and sisters, we need to show up with the healing power and the healing ministry of Jesus. Any thoughts that you want to add to that, or just kind of encouragement for us?
Just, I am in the midst of tragedy. Um, it's so amazing how when you have Christ within your heart and He's the center of your life, that there's still hope. Um, I tell you, because it's within the midst of tragedy that there can be that triumph, where we see the grace of God just working miraculously in the lives and hearts of people, um, drawing together, unforeseen, um, individuals and people together, to be able to accomplish wonderfully reconcilable things that are just,
Yeah.
they defy worldly description.
Yeah.
And we have an opportunity as the church, as collectively. I mean, since 2019, you've had, the George Floyd and the fallout,
Yeah.
and the conversations that have come from that, and
Yeah.
it's just has gotten harder and harder for the church, the Christian community, to remain, say, kind of distant and ignorant
Exactly.
and non-committal
Yeah.
with these conversations that everybody else in the world is having.
Exactly.
And so we've got to come to grips with it. And we have this amazing opportunity, kind of following in this last 2.5 years,
Yeah.
and having to go through this, unique relationship together of COVID,
Yeah.
having to navigate all of that has affected every one of us, not just certain ethnicities here and there.
Yeah.
Um, and the church, we have a hope,
Yeah.
and it's time for, our lives to speak as loudly as our words have been. Um, and I'm encouraged that as we 'cause I really I've been encouraged for our fellowship with much of the conversation and the interact and dialogue that's been happening with this Indigenous tragedy out of Kamloops, and people are engaging with the conversation,
Yeah.
and so it fills me with hope that that our on various levels of our fellowship, from national level down
Yeah.
through to our local level, believers in Christ are engaging with what
Yes.
our world is going through,
Yeah.
and it serves us well to stay in the valley to
Yeah.
minister to those that are there.
Yeah. Yeah. And for all of our church planters out there listening, build this culture into the DNA of your church right at the beginning.
Yeah,
That you're going to, like, so that this is just going to seem very natural, that there's care for our Indigenous people, to be aware of the Indigenous needs in our communities. Dan, thanks. You wear a bunch of different hats. Um, One of the hats I feel is that you're grieving. You know, there's a
yeah.
heaviness in your own personal heart, being Indigenous, and so we want to come alongside you and bless you. Anything we can do to help you and others to bring care and consolation and healing to wholeness to our Indigenous communities. Please keep speaking. You are quietly a prophetic voice. I believe that God is using you and raising you up, and so we're grateful that you're in our family, and but you speak truth, but with grace, and just reminds me so much of how Jesus was described. I see Christ in you. And so we need more education, we need more wisdom, and you've shared some practical things with us today, and for that I'm very grateful. And if people want to reach out to you, how can they connect with you?
Um, yeah, they can reach me at director at aboriginalbibleacademy.ca,
Okay.
same website, aboriginalbibleacademy.ca. Also, another email, that's my ABA hat email,
Yeah.
my Mission Canada Indigenous Guiding Group um, hat is Daniel.Collado, my last name, Collado, at paoc.org.
Yeah.
If people want to reach me there.
Yeah.
But,
Well, I hope they do, and not overwhelm you though, because you still have a job to do. But grateful, very grateful today for you and your family and the great work you're doing at ABA and with Mission Canada. So thanks for jumping on today. It won't be the last time. So till next time, thanks, Dan.
all right. Thank you, Paul. God bless you.